A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes speaking last is very helpful, but sometimes it is not, because I've got to catch the 8 o'clock flight, 7 o'clock I've got to be at the airport, 6 o'clock I've got to leave this place, I've got to be in the car. So let's see how it is to be adjusted. I've been allotted 1.5 hours to speak, but there's such a lot to do. I think let's start. First and foremost, I think I must thank Narendra Swami and Nagendra for having been so nice to me, looking after me so well. Thank you, sir. Second thing is, I basically, whenever I speak, it's more of an interaction. But today I think that interaction might not be possible because we are running short of time and there's lots of grounds to cover. First and foremost, before I start, I make one pronouncement. This pronouncement will be very true. Just mark me. I was a judge in the Consumer Court, Government of Maharashtra, for a very long time. I demitted office in 2002. During that time, when I demitted office, we normally had one case of medical negligence once in 15 days. You know, we used to adjudicate upon all kinds of problems, but one case of medical negligence once in 15 days. But today, practically 12 years after I've demitted office, if you see the board of the court, you have 3 cases every day. That means in a matter of 15 days, there are 45 cases. What I want to tell you all is, the incidence of medical litigation has gone up 45 times in a mere 12 years. Remember this. Once upon a time, we used to be a little concerned, but trust me, in another 5 years, there might be none of us against whom there is no case of medical negligence. Whether you are a practicing physician, or whether you are a hospital owner, or whether you are a hospital administrator. I'll go one step ahead, and I will say in another 10 years from now, another 10 years, mark me, at cocktail parties like the one we had yesterday, the basic discussion will be, one will say, I've got 7 against me, and another one will say, I've got 15 against me. You know, the number of cases against you will be the criteria of how good your practice is. Remember this. You know, more the cases, Tufan practice. You know, that is the way it is going to be evaluated. But keeping that apart, a very little basic fundamentals about law, because I've got a lot of students over here. Law is usually divided to 2 categories. You know, the first category is something known as a statutory law, where there is a statute, there's a law book. Like for example, the Indian Penal Code is a statute, the Consumer Protection Act is a statute, the PCPNDT Act is a statute, like the MTP Act is a statute. So this is a statutory law. Statutory law is basically made or enacted by the Parliament or by the Assembly, if at all it's a state law. As against the statute, there's another kind of a law which according to me is even more important, and that is known as the judge-made law. It is also known as precedents, it is also known as authorities. And this precedents or authorities keeps on changing with the changing judicial bench. You know, it keeps on changing. Why am I telling you this? I am telling you this is because I am going to address you all on something known as the law of medical negligence as applicable to a hospital administrator. And the law of medical negligence is a pure judge-made law. It is the judges who tell us what is negligence and what is not negligence. Therefore, let us go into the subject. What the judges say is negligence and what the judges say is not negligence vis-a-vis the hospital administrator. I've picked up certain topics and I'll tell you what those topics that I'm going to discuss today, time permitting. The first topic that I want to talk to is something known as vicarious liability. This is something which is very important, which every hospital administrator must know today, because whenever there's a case of medical negligence, you've got to fight together with the doctor and not against the doctor. Because many times the hospitals don't back up the doctors and finally they land up in a mess. The second important thing that I'm going to discuss is the liability of the dean or the medical superintendent in a state-owned hospital. It is something totally different. The third thing is, whenever there are payment problems, what does the law say? You know, because hospitals have to collect money after they treat. And when money payment is a problem, what are the various situations and how the law looks into it? The next very important topic that I want to discuss today is hospitals resorting to cut practice. You know, have you noticed this? This has started now. The hospitals are giving payment, kickbacks in the form of check, in the form of cash, depending upon how the referring doctor wants it paid. I'll discuss what those problems are. Next is going to be a HIV positive doctor in the hospital. There is a surgeon who is HIV positive, likely to infect. What does the law say? and what is the responsibility of the hospital vis-a-vis such HIV positive doctors. Next is getting RMOs is a bad problem. So there are a lot of non-allopathic RMOs working in allopathic hospitals. So what are the legalities? The next topic is cross-speciality practice. Today, hospitals appoint on full-time basis a surgeon and expect him to operate everything and anything that is possible. Surgeons land up doing cesarean sections, land up doing hysterectomies because they want to generate more and more work from a single surgeon that the hospital administration appoints. So what is the law with respect to a general surgeon doing hysterectomy, for example? Next is surrogacy problems. There are certain problems that have come up which most of the hospital administrators, I bet, do not know about this. Surrogacy is up and coming, and along with this surrogacy, there are a lot of administrative problems that have come in which needs to be discussed. I think I should stop here, no? Because I will not be able to cover. Why waste time? Okay. Now first is, let me come straight to hospitals owned by the state and what is the liability of the dean or the medical superintendent of such hospitals for the infrastructure present in the hospital. I told you, law of medical negligence is basically a judge-made law. So what is the judgment on this particular issue which lays down the law is I'm going to discuss. And for those of you all who are interested in the citation, I will always give you all the citation before I speak, because you can always go to the Google and put this citation and you will get the entire judgment, and all these judgments that I'm going to quote today are worth reading. This particular topic is governed by a Supreme Court decision in a case known as Paschim Banga versus the Khet Mazdoor Samiti. I repeat, Paschim Banga Khet Mazdoor Samiti versus, I beg your pardon, versus the state of West Bengal. That is the citation. I repeat, Paschim Banga Khet Mazdoor Samiti versus the state of West Bengal. Here what happened was, there was a farm worker, a Khet Mazdoor, and he was traveling in a train and he met with a head injury. The moment he met with a head injury, they stopped the train and they took him to a primary health center in the state of West Bengal. They took him to 9 primary health centers, and every primary health center did not have the infrastructure to treat this particular poor person. So finally they got fed up and they took him to Calcutta, and there he was operated, a craniotomy was done, and there was decompression of that hematoma that was there. The person finally got well. Now this Khet Mazdoor Samiti filed a case directly in the Supreme Court and told the Supreme Court the sad state of the state-run hospitals, and the Supreme Court has come out with a very beautiful decision in this particular case. The Supreme Court has gone on record to say that all state-run hospitals are duty-bound to treat each and every patient that they come across. They cannot refuse any patient for whatsoever reason. The Supreme Court has gone on record by saying that if you don't have a cot, treat the patient on a stretcher. If you don't have a stretcher, treat the patient on a trolley. If you don't have a trolley, you treat the patient on the floor. But you must treat the patient. You must never say no to the patient. These are state-run hospitals. Second thing that the Supreme Court has said, that every equipment that is there in the state-run hospital must work to its optimal capacity. And if at all these instruments do not work to its optimal capacity, the person in charge of the hospital will be criminally liable. The word is criminally liable. The moment the word criminally liable comes in, it means all state-run hospitals and all heads of these institutions, mind you, if at all there is a problem, you will land up behind bars, because it is a Supreme Court judgment, it is a law of the land, and it cannot be challenged by any lower courts. It cannot be disputed in front of any lower courts. So make it a point to see that all the equipments that you have, may it be an X-ray machine or may it be a CT scan, it is working in its absolutely perfect condition. And never, never, ever refuse a patient. Even if you don't have facilities, treat the patient on the floor, but treat the patient. This is what the responsibility of the chief of such hospitals comes down to. With that, I will go to the law of vicarious liability, another very important law which I think my students here will be very much interested. The seniors know about it. The law of vicarious liability is a concept that is seen in the law of torts. Now let's not go into that because I'm not teaching law. But then the first time this particular law of vicarious liability was implemented was done by Lord Justice Denning in a very important case, which was a UK case, which goes by the name of Roe versus Ministry of Health. Now, what happened in this case and how this particular law has been settled is something interesting. Now, in Roe versus Ministry of Health, what happened was, there was a person, this particular Mr. Roe, who had a problem on his toe for which he was to be operated. Well, the surgeon said, let's operate upon him, and the anesthetist said, let's give him a spinal. And the anesthetist gave him a very beautiful spinal. During those days in England, this was some 40 years back, 50 years back, the xylocaine ampules were preserved in a bottle of phenol, and every time the sister used to take a chital forceps, remove one ampule of xylocaine and give it to the anesthetist, who used to break it and give the spinal. And such a spinal was given in this case as well. The surgery went off very well. But after the surgery, the patient just would not come out. He was identified to be having permanent paraplegia of both his limbs post-spinal. Well, the matter was filed in the court. Everybody were taken to the court. And as the matter was there in the court, the hospital conducted an internal inquiry. And in the internal inquiry, they identified that that particular batch of xylocaine that was supplied had microscopic openings, as the result of which this phenol percolated into the xylocaine, and the xylocaine was infected or infested, or you may call it whatever you want, with phenol. And when this was used, you know, phenol is neurotoxic. It destroys the nervous tissue. So there was complete transaction at the cord at the level of L4, L5, L3, L4, sorry. So it was complete transaction. And this transaction resulted in a permanent paraplegia of both his limbs. This was the internal inquiry findings. Well, these findings were placed before the court, and the court gave a very beautiful judgment. This particular judgment is famous for two issues. The first issue is the concept of foreseeability when it comes to the law of medical negligence. Today the law says that you and I, suppose there is a problem, what becomes very important to decide for the courts is whether this particular problem that came up was normally foreseeable or not, was reasonably foreseeable or not. If at all it's a foreseeable problem, then yes, we have to pay compensation. But if at all it's a problem that was not reasonably foreseeable, then whatever may be the end result, whether it's permanent paraplegia, the surgeon and the hospital does not land up paying compensation. So in this particular Roe's case, not a single rupee was, not a single pound or a penny was paid as compensation to this particular person. Now Roe's case is famous for another small important thing, and that is law of vicarious liability. Lord Justice Denning, who's supposed to be one of the masters in medical law, he has laid down the law here. He says that for anything that happens under the roof of the hospital, whether it is from a full-timer or whether it's from a part-timer or whether it's from a nurse or whether it's by a ward boy, if any mess up takes place at the hands of these people are not accountable to pay compensation, but it is going to be the hospital administration that is accountable to pay compensation. Something which is a very strong statement, but that is the first time when this particular law of vicarious liability got incorporated into medical law, and so very correct. Because the principles of law of vicarious liability is respondent superior. That means what? Let the person who is economically superior pay, and that does not mean that he lands up just paying. The person who pays has also got the right to recover the money from the erring employee, but this recovery will never be lump sum. This recovery will always be in the form of small installments. Therefore, one question always comes up. If at all the hospital administration wants to escape the liability of vicariously paying for their employees, what is it that they must do? Should I tell you all this? Yeah? Something very important. See, a relationship between people can be of various types. The first is employer-employee relationship. The second thing is principal-agent relationship. And the third is relationship between an employer and an independent contractor. Now, what is the difference? The difference is there are 4 questions you need to ask. The first question is who employs whom? The second question is who can sack whom? The third question is who pays whom? And the fourth thing is who controls whom? If at all these 4 questions are answered in the affirmative, pointing towards one person, that person becomes the employer and the other person becomes the employee. And whenever the relationship between 2 people is that of employer or employee or principal or an agent, for the acts of the employee or for the acts of the agents, it is the principal or the employer who lands up paying compensation. But when it comes to the third entity, the independent contractor entity, for the acts of an independent contractor, it is not the employer or the hospital that lands up paying compensation. Now, I'll tell you a very beautiful case law on which this particular fact that I'm now going to say is going to be based on. This particular problem took place in Mumbai. There was a 124 kg patient with multiple fibroids. Well, she had to undergo a hysterectomy. She was taken up for a hysterectomy. You know what it is. Obesity is one of the worst enemies of a surgeon. So big incision, the surgery went off for 7 hours, and at the fag end of the surgery, the patient arrested on the table. Patient couldn't be revived. Subsequently, the patient was declared dead. Patient was closed, and the body was sent for postmortem. Somehow, I don't know how, but the postmortem report turned out to be overdose of anesthesia. The moment this particular report came as overdose of anesthesia, don't ask me how that report has come, but it has come. So what happened was the matter went to the court, and in the court, that is the state commission level in Maharashtra, in Bombay, the court said that, well, anesthetist messed up. Well, the anesthetist was not called by the patient. The surgeon called the anesthetist, and therefore for the acts or omissions on the part of the anesthetist, the surgeon has to pay. That is how the reasoning was done. So surgeon was asked to pay compensation for the mess up done by the anesthetist. Most of the anesthesia faculty was thrilled when this judgment came. You know, literally, because they always had a grouse, and that grouse was the surgeon collected a neat packet on behalf of the anesthetist and paid the anesthetist peanuts. No? That is what usually happens. So now they said, if at all you are not going to pay me money for my mess up, you pay money. The surgeons were also very nervous. The surgeon went into appeal, and finally the appellant court decided otherwise. Now what did the appellant court say? The appellant court said that this particular anesthetist is neither an employee nor is this anesthetist an agent, but this particular anesthetist is an independent contractor, and therefore anesthetist can be held accountable for the acts of the anesthetist, and the surgeon need not pay for such problems created by the anesthetist. Now what is the reasoning given? They applied this particular 4 criteria. Who appoints whom? It is the surgeon who calls the anesthetist. Who can stop calling whom? Who can sack whom? The surgeon can stop calling the anesthetist. Who pays whom? It is a surgeon who pays the anesthetist. And who controls whom? Here is the question. So when the surgeon is operating, is it possible for the surgeon to control the acts of the anesthetist, was the question. And the answer to this question is no. The surgeon cannot control the anesthetist, more so when the surgeon himself is operating. And therefore, when this 4th issue is in the negative, then this particular law of vicarious liability does not become applicable. Therefore, when hospital administrators or hospital organizations, hospitals ask me, sir, how do I protect my hospital from this particular problem? My answer is very simple. When you draft a contract between you and the particular surgeon or the particular person you are appointing, put it in no uncertain terms that your services are acquired in the capacity of an independent contractor. If at all you use these words, independent contractor, automatically the law of vicarious liability will not become applicable. He will become accountable for his own problems. So this is the beauty of the law of vicarious liability. So it all depends upon how you look at it. And if you look at it in a very nice manner, you can get away with a lot of things. But mind you, you will have to pay on behalf of the erring employee. You can recover it on behalf of the erring employee, whatever you have paid, provided you don't get the insurance coverage. If suppose the insurance pays you, you have a professional establishment errors and omissions policy. If that policy pays you for whatever you have paid, then you cannot recover it from your employee. Remember this. Otherwise, it will amount to something known as illegal enrichment. That is, you take from the employee and you take from the insurance company also. This is something law does not allow you to do. Okay. Normally I would have allowed a question, but there is no time. Let's cover up. There are lots of interesting things for me to tell you. Now the third thing is, kickbacks of the paid by the hospitals. This has become a fad in Bombay. I don't know whether it has started here. I don't know. But then I don't think even if you are giving it, you are going to tell anybody. So this is a bad problem in Bombay. And formerly it was surgeons giving kickbacks to the GPs or the family physicians who used to refer. But today it's not that. Today it is the institutions who pay kickbacks, and that also they do it in the form of a check. Now, what is this problem and how this problem is important for us to discuss in this meeting is something I tell you. This was one case I argued. See, in Bombay there is a big chain of diagnostic centers. I'll not take names because I'm recorded over here, so I don't want to take names. So a big chain of diagnostic centers, and they look after pathology, radiology, CT scan, MRI, they've got everything, and they only look after such services. One doctor by the name of Dr. Bavaskar, who's supposed to be today's Harish Chandra, that's what we call him. He referred one patient to this particular chain in Pune. The MRI was done, some 4,500 rupees was charged, and Bavaskar on the next day, third day, promptly received a check from this particular diagnostic center. 1,200 rupees check was paid. Well, this particular person, Bavaskar, is Harish Chandra, Raja Harish Chandra. So he said, no, I don't want it. And he returned it. And he said, give it to the patient if you so want. Well, what the diagnostic center did was, diagnostic center sent this particular check to the patient, and they named it as discount. They said that it's a discount we are giving you. Discount was paid. The person encashed the check. Afterwards, what happened was, this Raja Harish Chandra, what he did was, he directly filed a complaint against the diagnostic chain, diagnostic center, with the medical council. And there he said, this is unethical practice conducted by the medical center, so you take the medical center to task. Now, the medical center, the Maharashtra Medical Council, issued a notice. And on the very first day, the son of the owner of this diagnostic center went to the medical council, and there, left, right, and center, he was hammered. He came out crying, spoke to his daddy. His daddy was my classmate, right from first MBBS till MD we were together. I went into OBGY and he went into radiology. That's how it was. So the very next day, this particular owner came and sat in my chambers and said, Gopi, do it. My name is Gopinath and I'm known as Gopi everywhere, So he said, you have to do it. Whatever is there, you have to do it. I said, give it to me. So I went to the medical council on the next date, and the first issue that I raised was, does the medical center have authority or jurisdiction to pass such summons on a private limited company? Because this particular diagnostic center was a private limited company, and private limited company are out of the purview of the medical centers, of the medical councils, because medical councils only have jurisdiction over a registered medical practitioner. See, I'm not giving you all ideas to give kickbacks, please. Because see, I'm being recorded, so I've got to be very clear. So that was the issue that was taken. The moment I told them, see, what can you do? What can the medical council do to a private limited company? Because this particular organization that sent the check and did the investigation was a private limited company. So what can you do? I said, see, the maximum thing that the medical council can do is warn you, or temporarily suspend your registration, or permanently suspend your registration. And this is possible only and only when the person's name is there in your register. Now, this particular private limited company's name is not there in the register. So there is no question of medical council taking any action which can be executed against a private limited company. Somehow, this medical council did not decide the case for 6 or 7 times. The dates were put on, and every time they tried to push away. But finally I had to tell them, you do something about it. You either say that you don't have jurisdiction, close the file, or you say you have jurisdiction, I will do what is required to be done. Reluctantly they said, yes, we have jurisdiction, and they passed an order to that effect, which was such a foolish thing. So we got the order, we moved the High Court, and on the very first day, first hearing, the High Court stayed the order. And ladies and gentlemen, the best thing to tell you is, on day 3, when the High Court stayed the order, on day 3, you know what happened? The Medical Council of India came out with a notification saying that the state medical councils have jurisdiction only over individual doctors, and they have no jurisdiction over organizations. Have you read that notification? That notification has come. That means what? That means as an individual person, giving kickbacks is an offense. But when it comes to a company, whether it's a privately limited company or a public limited company, it's a company, giving kickbacks is not an offense. That was one of the arguments I put forth in the medical council. I said, what is it that the company has done? The company has given a discount, and it is within the framework of the company law to give a discount. A company can give a discount. If you read the newspapers, you will say Maruti is giving a discount on a car. So and so company is giving a discount on the car. Giving discount is something which is absolutely within the framework of the company law, and therefore this particular company, by giving a discount, has not violated any law. Now, such a beautiful, the way things are argued, it all depends upon how you argue it. So what is the bottom line? If your hospital is a private limited company, if at all it's a public limited company, then go ahead, you can give discounts. I'm not saying kickbacks, I'm saying you can definitely give discounts.
Dr.
Okay.
Gopinath,
Yeah,
I think Karnataka Legislative Assembly has passed a resolution where it has empowered the Karnataka Medical Council, telling that it has powers on organizations also. Does it?
It has no meaning. I'm repeating again. Whatever may be the resolution passed, if at all the medical council finds that a particular organization has done something which is not correct, okay? What can the medical council do to the organization? What can it do? The only thing that the medical councils can do is it can warn, it can temporarily suspend the registration or permanently suspend the registration. Organizations are not registered with the medical council. Under the situation, is it possible for the medical councils to do anything to such organizations? Answer is no. And if any one of you all want the notification, MCI notification with respect to the statement that I made, that medical councils do not have any jurisdiction over organizations, I'll definitely give it to you. I have it with me. I'll give it to you all. So that is how it is. And well, the organizations, the companies are doing nothing wrong. You know, there are three kinds of wrongs. Do you know this? The first wrong is something known as a legal wrong, which is normally adjudicated in the court of law. The second wrong is something known as an ethical wrong, which is normally adjudicated where? In the medical councils. The medical councils looks after everything that is ethical or unethical. And there's a third kind of a wrong. Anybody can tell me what this third kind of a wrong is? The third kind of a wrong is known as moral wrong. And a moral wrong is adjudicated in the temples, the priests, gurudwaras. You know, one of our president, Gyani Jail Singh, was ordered to clean the utensils for a moral wrong that he did, a gurudwara that was there in the newspapers. So that is the punishment that was given to him by the priests of the gurudwara for a moral wrong that he created. So medical councils can look after only ethical wrongs, and that too with respect to only the registered medical practitioners only, nothing else. Okay? So with that, we'll go to the next. Okay. The next problem is something that really bothers every hospital administrator and every hospital owner, and that is a recovery of the money, you know, recovery of the money from the patients. The patients just don't pay. And when they don't pay, there is absolute problem, because finally it is the balance sheet that matters to us at the end of the year. How much we have earned and how much we have lost. And that is possible only when we recover the money that we have spent on our patients. So this particular issue can be discussed at three levels. The first level is patient does not have money prior to admission. The patient comes and says, I don't have money, you treat me. First issue. The second issue is patient pays a deposit, treatment goes on, and somewhere in between the deposit is exhausted, and subsequently the patient says, I don't have money. Then what do you do? And the third thing is something even more interesting. Well, the patient is treated, the patient dies, there is an outstanding amount, and the relatives are saying, we don't have money. You understand? So this money problem is something very interesting which we need to discuss. We'll discuss it out. The first issue is a sick patient comes, a patient in bad state comes, accident victim comes, and well, he doesn't have a single rupee in his pocket, and he comes to a tertiary care center, and the tertiary care center coolly asks, you will have to pay a deposit of 2 lakhs of rupees before you enter, otherwise we will not be able to give you admission. This is something which often happens, everywhere it happens, in every state it happens. Is this correct? And what is the law that governs this particular situation is something that I'm going to now discuss. Now this particular problem is based, this particular solution to this particular problem is based on a very famous Supreme Court judgment which goes by the name of Pandit Paramananda Katara versus the Union of India. In this case, what happened, I'll tell you, and how the law got settled is something that is very interesting, because you will deal with this problem tomorrow. As young hospital administrators, you will deal with this problem tomorrow. See, here what happened, on the road just outside a hospital, there was a two-wheeler accident, a scooter accident. The victim had a head injury, polytrauma. He was picked up and brought to the hospital. The moment he came up to the hospital owner said, well, this is a medico-legal case. I don't want to touch it. Take this patient to the nearest public hospital. The nearest public hospital was around 20 kilometers from that site. He was taken by the people, put in a taxi and taken to the public hospital. And unfortunately, before he landed in the public hospital, he was declared dead. This was the case. The moment he was declared dead, there was a hue and cry made, and in the next day's newspaper, on the first page, this particular issue got printed. The issue was, hospitals do not treat patients in spite of the fact that these patients are serious. The moment this happened, there was one public-spirited man by the name of Pandit Paramananda Katara. What he did was, he directly filed a writ petition in the Supreme Court and told the Supreme Court, this is what hospitals and this is what doctors are doing. So there must be certain guidelines that the Supreme Court must give to prevent such a death subsequently. And he was so right. So the Supreme Court issued notices to everybody, and everybody were heard. And afterwards, the Supreme Court came out with a very beautiful decision. The decision that the Supreme Court gave was that when the patient comes to you in the state of an emergency, you cannot refuse the patient. Whether you are from the private sector or whether you are from the public sector, you have to treat the patient irrespective of the patient's capacity to pay. So what does this mean? This means that suppose there is a head injury patient or a patient with polytrauma who comes to your hospital and says, I have to be admitted, you cannot say that just because you don't have money to pay the deposit, I'm not going to keep you in. You have to keep him in. Because if at all something happens, God forbid, defending you in the court of law might become very difficult. So you have to admit. So that is why, irrespective of whether the person has money or not, you admit and you treat him. And now you will say that, well, if we start doing this to each and every patient, what is going to happen to the hospital? Well, normally such problems do not come every day, but as and when they come, it is to be managed. That is the law. Now I come to the second issue. The second issue is, the person has paid a deposit of 2 lakhs of rupees, got admitted, ICU, lot of money is being spent every day, and finally a stage comes when the money that he has paid is exhausted. And then the hospital promptly sends him a reminder. And that reminder is, your deposit is over, please pay. And the relatives suddenly become scarce. You know, it's a very common problem. The relatives become scarce, they just don't come. And whenever you catch hold of them, they say, I don't have money. So then, can you stop the treatment and transfer the patient to a public hospital is the question. This is something that you must be thinking. That's the next available thing that is there. But can you do it? On this, there is a very beautiful judgment given by the courts. And this is the judgment, that a very famous judgment known as Ruby Hospital Calcutta case. That is what it is known as. Here the same thing happened. There was a cyclist, a person on the cycle, who was banged by a four-wheeler. He had a lot of polytrauma, including a head injury. He was directly taken to Ruby Hospital, which was the closest tertiary care center. Well, he was directly admitted to the ICU. He went on a ventilator. Then what happened was, his friends who were there, whatever money they had, they collected together and paid the hospital that money as deposit. Within 3 days, whatever deposit was paid was exhausted. And then the hospital administration started asking the relatives, you pay. And the relatives said, we don't have money to pay. Then the hospital said, then instead of seeing that the money keeps on increasing, your debts keep on increasing, we'll transfer you to a public hospital, a patient on the ventilator. Well, the relatives were poor people. They really didn't know what was happening. So what the hospital administration did, they put the patient on an ambu bag, disconnected the ventilator, put the patient on an ambu bag, and transferred the patient in an ambulance to the nearest government hospital. And as luck or ill luck would have it, before he reached the government hospital, the patient died. This was a young boy, died. This was the case. The moment this happened, well, the parents, after all, it hurts. Just because of we didn't have money, we could not avail of the treatment of a good hospital. He was doing well, he was on a ventilator. The matter went to the court. And the court has come out with a very beautiful decision. And this decision is, all hospital administrators must hear me out. The decision is, if at all you have started treatment, you have got no business to discontinue the treatment or transfer the patient to some other hospital just because the patient does not have money to pay. How correct, na? Huh? After all, see, these problems don't take place every day. So once in a way, if at all this problem does come up, this is what the law expects from the hospital owner. And this is how the law is settled. Now the third issue is even more interesting. The third issue is, I told you, patient is treated well, unsuccessful, the patient dies. There is an outstanding bill of say 3 lakhs of rupees. Example. The relatives say, I don't have money to pay. The hospital says, what? Pay the money, until then we will not release the dead body. Very common problem, you know, it happens everywhere. Pay the money or will not release the dead body. Now what is the law on this topic is something which is, I'm going to tell you. See, the law on this topic has changed through time. The first time this particular issue came up, it came up before the Tamil Nadu State Commission. And the hospital involved was Apollo Hospital there. Here what happened, the same thing happened, some 2.25 lakh rupees was outstanding and the patient died. The widow was asked to pay and the widow said, I don't have money. The hospital promptly said, I will not release the dead body. The widow then ran out and collected money and finally paid the hospital and took the dead body, cremated the dead body. After everything was over, you know, normally there is a lull before the storm, and this lull normally is the 13 days period, you know, that 12-13. You know, after the 13 week, then the storm starts, you know. Normally, always remember that. First 13 days, everything is quiet, and then it blows. Huh? So on the 13th day, the problem started. There was a legal notice, and amongst the problems, other problems, one of the problem is, you did not release the dead body, in spite of the fact that we promised to pay you subsequently. Well, the matter went to the Tamil Nadu State Commission, and you know what the Tamil Nadu State Commission said? Tamil Nadu State Commission said, what the hospital has done is correct. Now, whenever the decision is given, there is always a reasoning to the decision. Now, what is the reasoning to the decision? The Tamil Nadu State Commission said, whatever transpires between a doctor and a patient is a pure contract, you know. The doctor contracts to render services, and the patients contract to pay consideration to the doctor for the services that the hospital has rendered. If at all the hospital has taken care of its part of the contract, it would be wrong for the patients or the patient's relatives not to honor their part of the contract. And therefore, hospitals asking for money is not wrong. That was the decision, that was the reasoning given. Well, the reasoning is correct. There is no problem with the reasoning. After this judgment, in Mumbai, there was another problem that took place, and this is a published judgment, so I can take the name. It is that big multi-star Hiranandani Hospital. You know, there also a similar problem took place, and this particular problem, the patient's mother, a doctor's mother died, and the doctor's mother the body was not released because the payment was not done. What this doctor did was, doctor said, you keep the body in the morgue, doesn't matter, and he directly moved the Bombay High Court. And the Bombay High Court came down very heavily upon the hospital. The Bombay High Court said in its reasoning, it is legally correct, you are legally correct, but are you morally correct to hold back somebody's dead body just because the money has not been paid? The High Court went to the extent of saying that, well, if at all the money is not paid, you can always file a recovery proceeding against the individual and recover your money. But just because the money is not paid, it is absolutely unethical and it is immoral to hold back somebody's dead body. It was so correct. Now, in between these two judgments, there was another problem that took place in Mumbai itself. And this particular problem was, in a smaller nursing home, there was a similar kind of a death, and some 75,000 rupees was outstanding. 75,000 rupees. Well, the doctor told the relatives, you pay the 75,000 and take back the dead body, take away the dead body, because the Tamil Nadu State Commission has said that we have a right to recover the money. Correct? In between these two judgments. You know what the relative said? The relative said, we don't want the dead body, you cremate it. I tell you, this is one and the only case where there was absolute home delivery of the dead body. You know, so sometimes it becomes a very risky proposal. Be very careful. And this has happened. Now, after this, very recently, I don't know whether it has come in the newspapers here in Bangalore, but in Bombay, 2 more incidences took place, and that is a person who had a neurosurgery done, and subsequently he was recovering very well. the hospital bills were mounting, and this happened in the Seven Hills Hospital, another corporate hospital. And the amount outstanding was a mere some 1.5 lakhs or quarter to 2 lakhs, not a very large amount. And the hospital said, we will not discharge you. Here he did not die. We will not discharge you. You pay the money and then take discharge. The moment this happened, what happened was, again there was a complaint made to the High Court, and sometimes complaint they converted into a suo motu writ petition. So there was a petition before the High Court, and the High Court once again came down very heavily on Seven Hills Hospital. And here, I don't know why the High Court gave such a ruling. The High Court said, you have to treat, it doesn't matter whether the patient is able to pay or not to pay. If at all there is an outstanding bill, and if the patient wants to go home, holding the patient against his will in the hospital is bad in law. That means what? That means today we just have to spend money, you have to treat the patients, and when it comes to collecting your fees, you cannot insist on it. If the patient says, I don't have money and I want to go home, holding him back in the hospital against his will would be bad in law. You know, these are certain problems that are taking place, because I don't know, that is why yesterday I said brand. You know, remember I said brand. You create a big brand, and when the big brand goes to the court, you know, the way the courts look at big brand hospitals is something totally different. So big brand is good, but if at all there is a problem, there is a big liability. The brand becomes a big liability. And it is true even in pharmas. If at all there's a small pharmaceutical company that creates a problem, the outgoing is much less. But if there's a giant, multinational giant, and if at all it messes up, the kind of compensation that the courts award against such multinational giants is something which is very exorbitant. Okay, now can I go to HIV problems? Because this is something which all hospital administrators directly face. Well, now, once upon a time we have always been taught, we doctors, when we did our MBBS, forensic medicine, we have always, stop me when you have to stop me. Otherwise, you know, sometimes even I just forget. Okay, see, HIV, let's go to the HIV problem. Something very interesting which you must know. And after I finish this HIV problem, I'll come to the proposition of a HIV positive surgeon on your faculty, and what is the hospital's liability vis-a-vis a HIV positive surgeon. I'll come to it. Something very interesting, something you must not have heard so far. See, normally when we have gone through our undergraduates curriculum MBBS, we have always been taught whatever transpires between a doctor and a patient is confidential, and we people are not supposed to speak about it anywhere else. It's going to be, you know, we are supposed to keep it amongst ourselves. Here there was a small problem on this, and the courts have gone to the extent of what, I'll tell you what happened. Let me tell you the case first. The case was, this is that very famous Dr. Yeptomi versus the Apollo Hospital case. Another very famous case. Here what happened, I'll tell you. There was a patient who was suffering from aortic aneurysm, and this particular patient was to be operated. So he, with his friend Dr. Yeptomi, came to Apollo Hospital Chennai, that is Madras, and then got himself admitted, and the surgery was proposed. Blood was required to be given, and Dr. Yeptomi said, I will give blood to my friend, so he donated the blood. Well, they checked his blood and they found Dr. Yeptomi was HIV positive, so they discarded his blood. There were other people who donated. The surgery went off very well. The patient came back to Nagaland. The patient was from Nagaland. After the patient came to Nagaland, this Dr. Yeptomi was engaged to a very beautiful girl by the name of Miss Akali. Okay? Well, in a small town, small village, you know how it is. Doctor getting engaged means something very big. So every household comes to know this particular doctor is engaged. After the engagement took place, the would-be in-laws, Miss Akali's parents, started hearing something. And that something was their would-be son-in-law is HIV positive. So what these parents did, Miss Akali's parents, what they did, they took the first available flight, came to Apollo Hospital Madras, sat before the CEO there. They sat, and they told him what the problem was. The hospital administrator there was very large-hearted. He called for the papers, and in the papers he saw, and it was written there that Yeptomi had donated the blood, and that blood was HIV positive, so that blood was discarded. So the parents of the girl were now sure that their would-be son-in-law is HIV positive. They came back to Nagaland, and you know the first thing that they did? The first thing that they did was they broke the engagement. And when they broke the engagement, the whole town was on fire. You know, everybody came to know. Dr. Yeptomi, HIV positive. Dr. Yeptomi, Sarva Guna Sampanna, you know, like that. So the thing was so bad, it was so bad, he just couldn't live there. So what he did, he packed up and then he moved directly to Chennai, and from there he filed a complaint directly in the National Commission, and his complaint was based on just one thing, and that is whatever transpires. Why I'm saying this is the hospital administrator is involved in such problems. So you might tomorrow have a similar situation. So what is the law on this? That is what I'm trying to tell you all. Huh? So all the cases that I have picked up is involving the hospital administrator. So his contention was very simple. Whatever transpired between me and my doctors and the hospital was confidential information. The hospital had no business to divulge this particular information without my consent, and this is exactly what they have done. They have told my would-be in-laws that I am HIV positive, as a result of which now today the whole town, like city knows about me being HIV positive. Nobody is going to give me a daughter, a girl in marriage, and now I'll have to live like this for the rest of my life. So I want compensation. That was the issue. The National Commission heard both the sides, and National Commission said, this is too complicated an issue to discuss. So you go to a civil court where proper evidence is recorded, and you will get justice. So National Commission dismissed the complaint. So Dr. Yeptomi got further annoyed. So he filed a complaint in the Supreme Court. He filed an appeal in the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court came out with a very beautiful decision that has practically changed the way we look at confidential information. You know what the Supreme Court said? Supreme Court said what Apollo Hospital Madras has done is perfect. There's nothing wrong in it. Now whenever a judgment is given, there is always an explanation given to that judgment, because without that explanation, that judgment really has got no meaning. Now what is the explanation given by this, in this particular judgment is, Supreme Court said that see, there are rights and rights. Here there are two rights that are involved in this particular case. On one side is Dr. Yeptomi's right to confidentiality, correct? And on the other side is Miss Akali's right to life. Because the Supreme Court said, if at all this particular marriage had consummated, Miss Akali would one fine morning become HIV positive, and her lifespan automatically would drop, correct? She would die prematurely. So she has a right to life. And whenever there is a clash between two rights, it is always the right to life that will override all other rights. What a beautiful reasoning they gave. So when somebody's life is at a problem, all other rights get demolished. The right to life will always stand above all other rights. And that is why the Supreme Court said what Miss Akali has done, what Apollo Hospital has done is perfect. Now that means what? That means if at all somebody comes to you tomorrow and says, I want to know the HIV status of this particular person, and if at all you give it, will you be correct or will you be not correct is the question, correct? So I'll give you a very simple example. A simple example. See, I'm a family physician, right? I'm a family physician. I look after the entire family. The husband comes to me, chronically ill, so I suspect something, I get his HIV done, okay? And he's HIV positive. The moment he's HIV positive, I counsel him. I tell him, be careful. And then what happens is, next time, whenever he has sex with his wife, he suddenly starts using condoms. A person who never liked condoms, now he wants to protect his wife at the same time he wants to have sex. So he suddenly starts using condoms. See, we always think wives are morons. We always think. But that's not so, huh? Wives are very intelligent. Wives know that here is a person who never liked to use condoms, and all of a sudden he started using condoms. So what the wife does, the wife comes and sits in front of the family physician and asks a very simple question. And that question is, what is it that my husband is suffering from? Will the family physician be justified in telling her, yes, your husband is HIV positive? Answer is yes. In today's scenario, he is justified. Prior to this particular judgment, he was not justified. But today he is justified because the Supreme Court says, if at all the doctors identify anybody who is at risk, and if at all they confide in him this particular confidential information that they possess, they will be doing nothing wrong. So today, if at all you tell a person who is identified to be at risk about the information, confidential information that you possess, you will be doing nothing wrong. I'll give you another situation. Now that you are hospital administrators over here and young hospital administrators in the making, I'll give you a very simple example. Is there a bounden responsibility on the family physician to go and inform the wife that her husband is HIV positive? See, wife also has a right to life, remember, and her life is now at stake. My question is, as a family physician, is it my bounden duty to go home and tell the wife, have a cup of tea and tell her, do you know your husband is HIV positive? Huh? Right? Because in law, there is an act of commission and there is an act of omission. If at all you don't inform, it becomes an act of omission. You can once again be dragged to the court for not informing. Is it correct? The answer to this question is no. There is no bounden duty cast upon the doctor who possesses this information to inform the person at risk. So the family physician need not go home and tell the wife about the HIV status of the husband. But if the wife comes to him, wife is a person who is at risk, and if he tells, he is doing nothing wrong. Now, why do I say this? See, listen to me. I'll give you the reasoning why I'm saying this. If you read the Yeptomi judgment, the Supreme Court is silent whether we are duty bound to inform the person who is at risk. It is silent. But it is my interpretation. Why? I'll tell you. A very simple hypothetical situation. In Bangalore, I am a gynecologist, okay? In Bangalore, there is a very beautiful commercial sex worker, and she is my patient. Huh? And when I examine her, I get her routine HIV done once in 6 months. And one fine morning, she is HIV positive. And I know half of Bangalore patronizes her. Okay? Now, if at all, there is a bounden duty upon me to inform all those people who are at risk, I'll have to put a public ad. You know, that is why Lord does not expect me to do that. And that is why I'm saying that there is no bounden duty cast upon me to inform the person who is at risk. But if at all this particular person comes to me and asks me about this particular situation, positively, yes, I should inform. Now I come to another problem which hospital administrators once again face. Suppose in your faculty, you have a surgeon who is HIV positive or HBsAg positive. Let's take it either ways. What will you do to such a person? See, I'm not talking about class 3, class 4 workers. So students, how will you manage this problem? You are the hospital head administrator, and one of the busy surgeons who is working in your hospital is identified to be hepatitis C positive. What will you do? Because what happens is, whenever the patient is operated upon, surgeons invariably get a small nick, and their body fluids can very easily contaminate the patient. And even if one drop of hepatitis C positive blood contaminates the peritoneum, the patient is at risk. Isn't it so? So what you as hospital administrators will do is the issue that needs to be discussed. And I'll tell you what happened. It is an actual problem that took place in Mumbai once again. It happened in Tata Memorial. Tata Memorial is a very big cancer hospital in Bombay. And there, the faculty routinely gets their blood examined. And one surgeon, a renowned surgeon, very busy surgeon, one fine morning identified that he was suffering from hepatitis C. The administration immediately asked him to stop work. No surgical work, but they gave him only OPD work. And when this particular problem took place, the surgeon got very much insulted. He said, how is it that you can stop me from operating? You are only giving me OPD duties and you're preventing a surgeon from operating. The surgeon is practically dead. So he moved the Bombay High Court. He said that I have every rights to operate. This particular problem did not reach its logical conclusion because this particular case was subsequently withdrawn. But what is the law on this particular subject is something which is interesting. There is a similar case in the US which involves one dentist. The dentist was HIV positive and the dentist was doing all kinds of dental surgeries in the mouth. This issue came up that whether it is possible that if at all it is possible for this particular dentist to infect his patients, he should stop operating, he should stop doing dental work, because what he is doing is he is putting that person's life into jeopardy. The US courts gave a decision on this, and that decision is if at all this particular dentist is prepared to take the universal precautions, then he is free to continue with his work. That is the decision. But in this Tata case, if I were the judge, what would I have done is the question. And I'll tell you what I would have done. This particular case was not decided. It was, removed from the court. It was settled and removed from the court much before the decision came. See, the surgeon has got a right to operate, and he must be operating some 300 patients maybe in a year, major surgeries in a year. These 300 patients are at risk of being infected by the body fluids of this particular surgeon. Suppose he accidentally gets a cut. So when the right of one individual is to be titrated with the rights of the society, the rights of the society will always override the rights of an individual. And therefore, if I were the judge, I would have said, no, you don't operate, stay in the OPD. That is the reasoning that it would have been given. So asking him to stay in the OPD and doing OPD work would be okay, but the settled law, which is a US law, says that if at all this particular surgeon is prepared to take the universal precautions, then he may be permitted to operate. But there is always a risk, whatever it may be, there always is a risk that he might infect his patients. Okay, with this I'll come to, I think we are running short of time now, no? Huh? I'll come to surrogacy. This is something which you must know, because I don't think anybody has ever spoken to you about certain problems in surrogacy which the doctors know, but the hospital administrators do not know. Yes, yes. Yeah, he wants me to speak on cross speciality, something very nice. We'll speak, yeah, because, surgeon doing hysterectomies, surgeon doing cesarean sections, and the hospital administration not appointing a gynecologist and making the surgeon do his work, what is the legality? That is how you save money, Huh? We'll come to it. Huh? Now, I'm on the issue of surrogacy. See, a lot of dirty things happen in surrogacy. You know what is surrogacy? A particular person is not able to carry a child, so A gives the sperm, B gives the ovum. A and B are married couples, so they are biological parents. There is an in vitro fertilization, an embryo is created. This embryo is put in X. X's womb, this embryo grows. So this X becomes a surrogate who carries this particular pregnancy to term and delivers the child and gives the child to the biological parents. That is how the system works. Now, there is a lot of risk here vis-a-vis the hospital administrator, because a lot of criminal issues come up, and what are these criminal issues is something I will tell you just now. See, today there is only a bill with respect to surrogacy. Bill means what? Bill means a law in the making. Now this bill is still not the law. This bill, when it is not the law, whatever is written in the bill is not enforceable in the courts. Remember, when there is no law on a particular subject, the law that is existing becomes enforceable. Therefore, what are the laws that become enforceable in a case of surrogacy is something I'll tell you. If you read the Indian Evidence Act, the Indian Evidence Act very clearly states that whosoever delivers the baby is the mother of the baby. Maternity need not be proved. The paternity has to be proved. Who is the father? Nobody knows. But who is the mother? Everybody knows, because she is the one who delivers the baby. So maternity need not be proved. So here what happens is, in surrogacy programs, what happens is, the person, the surrogate who delivers the baby is supposed to be the mother of the baby. And technically speaking, or legally speaking today, because there is no law, the biological parents have got to adopt this baby from the surrogate. Are you following me? The surrogate is the mother. So the biological parents, technically speaking, are supposed to adopt the baby. Now, adoption procedures normally take a long time and they're very tedious. So there is a via media identified by people. And do you know what this via media is? The via media is, this particular surrogate gets registered not in her name, but gets registered in the name of the biological mother. You understand what I mean? Surrogate is X. She does not get registered as X, but she gets registered as B. Now what happens? Everything is very easy. When you fill up the live birth certificate, it goes by the name of B. And then adoption procedures are totally circumvented. because from the municipal corporation, when subsequently you get a certificate, that certificate is in the name of B. So all that adoption procedures are sidetracked. Now this is something which is very rampantly done by everybody. And if at all you are yourself doing the surrogacy and you are yourself delivering the patient, then there is no problem at all. You can do what you want. But this particular problem happens in tertiary care centers also, which cater to obstetric patients. You never know whether the patient is a surrogate patient or patient has not undergone a surrogacy program. I'll tell you what problem that took place. One problem that took place, I'll tell you, and why everybody landed into trouble, including the hospital owner, is this. A similar thing happened. X got registered in the name of B. X delivered. After the delivery, X went into severe PPH and X died. On record, who has died? B. And now, can you remake the papers of X? You can't, because she cannot sign now. So she's out. So for all technical purposes, B is dead. This is something which is very rampantly happening everywhere, and it might also be happening in your institution, and you just must not be knowing about it, because the offense of impersonation comes in, and once an offense of impersonation comes in, the doctor goes into the dock, and along with the doctor, the hospital owner is also taken to the police station. So please be careful. Make it a point to see that every obstetric patient, this particular problem doesn't happen, and if at all it happens, you must take care to see that it doesn't happen, because suppose there is a death, then God help you, because then there is everything goes haywire. Okay, with that now I'll come to cross speciality practice. See, in 1999, in 1995 rather, there was a new terminology that came into medical practice, medical legal practice, a new terminology, and that terminology was cross-pathy practice. You know what is cross-pathy practice? There are 4 recognized schools of medicine, only 4. One is allopathic school, it is also known as modern scientific medicine. Second is Ayurveda. Third is homeopathy. And fourth is Unani. There are only 4 recognized schools of medicine. All the other schools are really no medicine at all. They best may be called as a science. You know, there are so many sciences are there, like acupressure is a science, acupuncture is a science, there is aromatherapy, there is magnetotherapy, there is, you know, so electrotherapy, there are so many therapies available, but they are not schools of medicine, remember. Amongst these alternative therapies, you know who is the luckiest? Can you tell me who is the luckiest alternative, and not these 4 people? The alternative is, you know, acupuncture is there, acupressure, aromatherapy, electrotherapy, you know, so many things are there. I would say acupressurist, you know, the one who gives acupressure is the luckiest. You know why? Because he gives pressures at such unwanted places, only he gets relief. You know, nobody else gets relief. You know, so he not only gets paid for it, but you want, I'm coming to it. I'll stop. No. I'm speaking about the schools of medicine. So this is 1995. A new terminology came up that if at all you are a graduate of allopathy, you must restrict your practice only to allopathy, and you should not do homeopathy. And if you are a homeopathic practitioner, you must not practice Ayurveda. You must not practice allopathic medicine. I'm skipping that because I was going to speak about, you know, non-allopathic RMOs in allopathic hospitals based on this particular law. In 1999, another issue came up, and that issue was cross-speciality practice. Now, what is this cross-speciality practice? Something very nice. You must understand this. You know, in one school of medicine, like in allopathic school of medicine, there are various subspecialties, right? You have general medicine, you have general surgery, you have orthopedics, you have neurosurgery, you have all these surgeries. Can a person who is a postgraduate in one specialty encroach upon somebody else's turf is the question. Like, I am a gynecologist. When I open an abdomen to an abdominal hysterectomy, can I remove the appendix is the question. Appendix falls into somebody else's domain, definitely does not fall into the domain of the gynecologist. So what is the law on this, and how is the law on this settled today? And that is that famous Prashant Dhananka versus the Nizam Institute, Hyderabad. Anybody from Nizam Institute here? Yes. You must be aware of this case? Yes. I will discuss it today. See. Now, what happened in this case? And here the hospital landed a paying compensation. Please, that's why I want to tell you all this. Hospital was held vicariously responsible. That is why the hospital administrators and hospital owners must hear me on this issue. See, there was a young boy by the name of Prashant Dhananka who had chronic respiratory problems. X-ray was taken and they identified that this particular person had a posterior mediastinal mass. Clinically, it appeared to be a neurofibroma. So what they did was, let's put in a needle and let's study the mass. The needle was put. But somehow the needle did not yield any diagnosis. So they said, we have no other option but to go in for a thoracotomy. So this particular boy, 15, 16-year-old boy, was referred by the Department of Medicine to the Department of Cardiothoracic Surgery. And the cardiothoracic surgeon said, okay, let's operate. And they undertook a thoracotomy. So as they were excising the mass, they identified that this particular mass was connected to the cord, spinal cord. So there was some amount of extra bleeding. So the neurosurgeons were called in. Neurosurgeons washed up and both of them excised the mass, closed the thoracotomy and came out. When the patient came out of anesthesia, it was identified he was having permanent paraplegia of both his limbs, confined to the wheelchair for the rest of his life. This was the issue. Well, the matter went to the court. Because today, remember, anything that goes wrong, matter goes to the court. Once upon a time, we believed that if at all we spoke nicely to the patient, public relations, if you maintain, patients will not go. That is all humbug. Today, if there's a problem, rest assured, the matter goes to the court. So, don't worry about anything. Speak to your lawyers. Okay? Don't speak to your patients, speak to your lawyers. That is what I have always been advising. Now what happens is, this particular matter went to the court. And the contention was very simple. The contention was, when the clinical diagnosis was of a neurological origin, neurofibroma, why is it that the patient was referred to the Department of Cardiothoracic Surgery, and why is it that a cardiothoracic surgeon operated upon me? This was the issue. When the matter came up for argument before the National Commission also asked this question to the hospital owners and the doctors. And the cardiothoracic surgeon promptly replied, anything to do with the mediastinum, it is only the cardiothoracic surgeon anywhere in the world who operates. A cardiothoracic surgeon, mediastinal problem, only we operate. But somehow the court did not accept it. And the court said that this amounts to something known as one specialist encroaching upon the turf of another specialist. So this amounts to cross-speciality practice, and some 16 lakhs of rupees was awarded as compensation to be paid by Nizam Institute on behalf of all the treating doctors. So hospital landed up paying money. Is this a good judgment? According to me, this particular judgment is not a good judgment. It is a lousy judgment according to me, but somehow it was given, and both of them went to the Supreme Court. The Nizam Institute said, our body can never be divided into watertight compartments. One specialty always overlaps into another. And Prashant Dhananka said, for the rest of my life, I am confined to the wheelchair. 16 lakhs is peanuts. I want something much more. So he went to the National Commission, Supreme Court, for enhancement of the award. Now let's discuss this particular judgment. I have said that this particular judgment is not a good judgment because our body cannot be divided. One specialty always overlaps into another. If at all this judgment were to be strictly followed, what will happen, tell me? See, the orthopedic surgeon will take away all the bones. The neurosurgeon will take away the brain and the spinal cord. The gynec fellow will take away the uterus, the ovaries, the tubes, and the vagina and the vulva. The pediatrician will take away all pediatric surgery. The oncosurgeon will take away all surgical problems. The plastic surgery will take away the breast and everything else. The ENT surgeon will take away all the ENT problems. Ophthalmologist will take away the eye. The question comes up is, what is left to the general surgeon? And I have always jokingly said, except for doing a PR, nothing is left. Correct? Now what is left? Nothing is left. That is why this particular judgment is not correct. But then the Supreme Court has given this judgment. Now here I will tell you why the mess. We need to identify these problems and we have to rectify these problems. See, when I was a student, I'm in practice for practically 40 years now, OBGY. I'm talking about the scenario 40 years back. I was in a public institution known as Nair Hospital, a very big teaching hospital in Bombay run by the municipal corporation. When I was a student, the Department of Cardiothoracic Surgery of Nair Hospital was headed by one Dr. K.N. Dastur, a very senior cardiothoracic surgeon who did not have any cardiothoracic qualifications. He was a pure MS General Surgery with FRCS, KN Dastot. But he was a very good hand, head of the department, always the convener when it comes to cardiothoracic examinations. Department of Neurosurgery was headed by one Dr. Daftari, who again was a FRCS, MS FRCS General Surgery. He was not a neurosurgeon by qualification, no. But then they were head of the departments. It was very much possible at that point of time, and the reason why it was possible at that point of time is because if you read the Code of Medical Ethics that is prior to the 2002 code, today the Code of Medical Ethics that is applicable to you and me is 2002 code. If you read the prior Code of Medical Ethics, it defined the word specialist as, specialist is a person who has the specialized qualifications or who has put in a good number of years in the specialty. These words, good number of years in the specialty, were very vital because it was based on this good number of years in the specialty. These stalwarts were the head of the departments of their faculties. Remember? Now what happened was, the Prashant Dhadanka judgment came in 1999 and in the year 2002 the Code of Medical Ethics changed. If you read the current code, it also defines the word specialist, and it says specialist is a person who has the specialized qualifications, and it stops there. Or put in a good number of years in the specialty. These words have been deleted. Now this has created a problem, because today you might be a cardiothoracic surgeon for donkey's years, but you don't have a cardiothoracic qualification with you. Can you do cardiothoracic surgery? Answer is no. And if at all you do it, it amounts to cross specialty practice, which is bad in law. As long as everything goes on well, it is all right. But if at all there's a problem, God help you, and defending you might become very difficult. That is why I have been saying this is not correct. Now what has happened is, Nizam Institute, I'll wind up now very fast. Nizam Institute and Prashant Dhadanka, both of them went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court heard both the sides and gave a decision. Do you know what decision Supreme Court gave? The Supreme Court said what National Commission has given is correct, ruling is correct, but the compensation given is not correct. It enhanced the compensation from 16 lakhs to rupees 1 crore. For the first time ever, a crore was awarded as compensation for a case of medical negligence, and that too for what? For cross specialty practice. So the things are very clear. If at all you make somebody do something which is not his domain, if at all something goes wrong, it becomes a hell of a problem to get that particular person out. Is there any solution to this problem? You want me to? There's a nice solution to this problem. This, I'll tell you what the solution, and then I'll stop if need be. Or do you want me to take one nice topic where can the directors of a hospital and the CEO be arrested? Or maybe we will keep it for some other time. It's something very interesting, huh? Please, it's not all that easy today to be the director of a hospital or a CEO of the hospital. Remember, very risky. Some other time maybe. That will carry on. He's not going to stop that flight for me, you know. Okay. Now I'm coming to the solution to this cross-speciality practice. And it actually has happened. And that is why I think the ball has now started rolling. I'll tell you what happened. See, in Bombay, a similar problem took place. In Bombay, there was a patient who had severe angina pectoris. Severe. So she got admitted to a hospital which was owned by a physician, MD, internal medicine. This particular physician had a ICCU. This particular patient was kept in the ICCU. Nitroglycerin drip, and everything was started. The patient settled down. And on day 3, this particular physician called in an interventional cardiologist, and they examined the patient. The interventional cardiologist said this patient might require angiography, SOS angioplasty, transfer her to a tertiary care center where we'll do in the procedure. On day 4, the patient was discharged. And when the patient was discharged, the problem usually starts. And it starts why? Because the bill is given to her. The moment the bill was given, why such a big figure? What have you done for 4 days? The doctor said, I've treated you in the ICU, so automatically the bills are going to be a little more. She paid grudgingly. She went to the tertiary care center, everything was done, and after she settled down, she sent a notice to this MD physician. And her notice very clearly said, you are a physician, you have got no business to practice cardiology, you have practiced cardiology, which is cross-speciality practice, pay me compensation. This was the case. Well, the physician was represented by an advocate in the court. They argued the case. The advocate said, this particular law has been settled by the Supreme Court, Prashant Dhananka case, so you pay compensation. A compensation was awarded. The matter went against the doctor. The moment the matter went against the doctor, it came in the newspapers, and the entire fraternity, MD internal medicine, who had a similar setup, hospital with the ICCU, started losing sleep, because all of them do the same thing. So they said, if at all this problem is going to happen, what are we supposed to do? They went to multiple advocates and they said, you please represent us and see that we come out of the mess. And all of the advocates said, the Supreme Court has decided the law, so we cannot do anything. Finally, they came to me. I was waiting. I said, okay, I'll take up the case, because now today I represent most of the hospitals and doctors. We go all over India. So I said, I'll take up the case. And ladies and gentlemen, I tell you, I won this case in appeal. How I did it, I'll tell you. How I did it is important to know. Now see, now watch. I was on the bench. I was a judge in the consumer court for a very long time. Most of the judiciary know me as a retired judge. And they also know I'm a gynecologist, a practicing gynecologist even today. Wherever I stand and argue, most of them also know me. So when this particular Dr. Trivedi came to me, I took up the case and we argued. The opening statement that I made, see, listen, how the issue was tackled. The opening statement that I made was, cross-speciality practice, the laws are perfect. Cross-speciality practice should never be permitted. Opening statement. The moment I said this, Dr. Trivedi, whom I was representing, literally threw a fit. He said, sir, what are you saying? I said, wait, let me complete. So I told the judge, it is correct. And I gave an example. I said, see, I'm a gynecologist. If at all I open somebody's skull tomorrow, if I do a craniotomy tomorrow, and the patient dies, should I be held accountable or not? A gynecologist expertises in the South Pole. If I open up the North Pole, will it be correct? It is not correct. A gynecologist doing craniotomy is not correct. The court said, yes, it is not correct. So I told the court, there are 4 reasons why it is not correct. There are 4. See, anything that happens in the court has got to be reasoned. So the moment you give a reasoning, they snap the bait. So the reasoning is why a gynecologist cannot do is, the MD Gynaec curriculum, does it have any chapter on craniotomy? Answer is no. My curriculum does not have anything to do with brain surgery. The second reason is, when I am undergoing my residency course, house post, registrar post, lecturer's post, do I manage any case of brain tumors? Answer is no. The third thing is, my curriculum recommends certain textbooks. You take any of the textbooks, and in those textbooks, is there a chapter on brain tumors? Answer is no. And the fourth thing is, in my exams, whether it is theory or whether it is viva voce, is there any question on brain tumors, or is there any short case or long case in brain tumors? Answer is no. So when these 4 parameters are in the negative, a gynecologist cannot do brain surgery. Technical. Now, I told the court, there is an exception to this law of cross-speciality practice. And the exception to this law are 3. The first thing is general medicine. Second thing is general surgery. Now all the surgeons are just a smile, general surgery. And the third one is emergency medicine. These are 3 exceptions to the general rule. So I told the court, now let's apply the same 4 rules to general medicine. So MCI curriculum is available on the net, and there cardiology is a part of the curriculum. Angina pectoris is a part of the curriculum of a person who is undergoing MD internal medicine. So that curriculum was kept in the court and said, angina pectoris and cardiology is a part of the curriculum. Second thing is, when a person is doing his house post, registrar's post, he sees so many patients of angina pectoris and he treats them. That is, he has hands-on experience when it comes to treating angina pectoris. Third thing is, Harrison's textbook of medicine was placed in the front of the court. It was placed in front of the court, and the chapter on angina pectoris was shown to the court. So the textbooks have a chapter on angina. And fourth thing is, a question paper was kept wherein a cardiology question was present. So cardiology is something which a person has got to be examined on when he is undergoing his theory as well as viva. So if these 4 questions are answered in the positive, the person positively can practice that. And the moment this was explained, the court realized it, and the court immediately passed an order in our favor. If the same thing was argued in the Prashant Dhananka case in the National Commission, don't you think that entire order would have changed? 100% yes. And that is why I have always been saying very good cases are lost because of bad advocacy. Trust me, huh? Listen to me. Because 40 years I have spent in medicine, sometimes I just don't understand what's happening. Even after putting so many years. What is he going to understand? You know, in half an hour's time, will he be able to understand what you are telling him? And when the court starts asking questions left, right and center, there is a mess up, you know, there is absolute bloodshed there in the courts. And that is why good cases are lost because of bad advocacy. Now, same thing holds true for general surgery. Now I come to the third exception. This is something very important, which is a good take-home message. Emergency, there are no laws applicable. In emergency, the only law that is applicable is whatever you do, you must do in good faith for the benefit of the patient. I gave the court an example. On the front row, there was one elderly advocate sitting. I told the court, here is an elderly advocate. Suppose he gets a cardiac arrest here on the table. I am a gynecologist. Can I say I'm not going to touch him because I am a gynecologist? Huh? And he has a problem which concerns his heart. And PV I just can't do on him. Correct? A male advocate. Huh? So will it be right if I say I'm not going to touch him? The answer is no. The answer is I have got to do everything possible to help him and save his life. So in emergency medicine, there is no law applicable. The only law that is applicable is you've got to do whatever you do in good faith for the benefit of the patient. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this is because to convert a case into emergency is in our hands. Na? So you can still get away with it. So that is how the law works. I think with that, ladies and gentlemen, I already have a signal. But wait. See, I enjoyed it as much as you all. When you address a very, very intelligent audience, you also get that kick, you know. But what I miss is the question answer session. Question answer session by and large. No, we don't have the time now. Huh? See, I'll tell you something else. One more speaker is there. See? Huh? No, he's outside. We are going together. You would have dumped me. No. See, listen to me. Parting. No, I'm also going to go. Parting. Now I'll part. You will take some questions?
I will initially, till this is resolved, I will permit one question that is my own as the chair.
6.
Now, when you say general practitioner,
You take me 1 hour to reach the airport? 1 hour? 45 minutes? I've got to be there at 7. Okay, come.
sir, when you say general physician, there are several nursing home owners who are MBBS qualified who also do a lot of other surgery. So do you say general physician? Does the MBBS person qualify to be a general physician?
Dinesh, please. MBBS person is doing surgery?
Yes.
No, that is wrong. Huh? Please. See, the law says you can do those things on which you have hands-on experience whilst you are doing that post. Huh? When you are doing your MBBS, whatever hands-on experience you have gathered, that is what you can do. A family physician, an MBBS person cannot remove an appendix. Huh? Please, that would be very wrong.
The second is people who have specialized, that is they've become a urologist or beyond, can they still dabble in general surgery?
No. The Code of Medical Ethics is very clear. The Code of Medical Ethics says once you call yourself a specialist, you must restrict your practice only to that specialty. So once, if I am MS with MCH in urology and I call myself as a urologist, then I must restrict my practice only to urology. So then I cannot remove an appendix. It is there in the Code of Medical Ethics. Yeah, come. Huh? Huh? That means then he should not call himself a cardiologist. Then he should call himself a general surgeon. But if you call yourself a cardiac surgeon, a cardiovascular surgeon, a cardiothoracic surgeon, then you must restrict your practice only to cardiothoracic surgery.
Sir, my question, very quick question is
Yeah.
that the cross-specialty practice, there is, with regard to surgery particularly, the 660 districts that we have got have no gynecologist. If they have the gynecologist, they don't have surgeons. If they have the surgeons, they don't have the orthopedic surgeons. And there are cases who come in acute emergencies in the country. Let's not talk, probably we are concentrating on Mumbai and Bangalore and Delhi. But the entire country, if there is a concept of rural surgery, there is the Association of Rural Surgeons of India. And in IGNOU, we developed a course, a one-year program in rural surgery for the postgraduate surgeons. A gynecologist is trained to do the general surgery as well as the orthopedic surgery and vice versa in order to save the lives of the patient. That's where I think these rulings, what do they, I mean, what are the
They become a big stumbling block because then there is a bad problem. But now I think maybe if this particular matter goes to the National Commission, subsequently to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court looks at this particular problem in a different way, things might change. There is another way of changing it. What is another way of changing it, which is much more simpler and easier? I think it's high time we have to change the Code of Medical Ethics. It is already 12 years old. The Code of Medical Ethics need to be rewritten, and if at all we can incorporate those words or put in a good number of years in the specialty, all our problems are solved. So if any one of you all are influential with the Medical Council of India, why don't you think in terms of rewriting the code?
Sir, do we take more questions or what do you say? Because I'm not
Yeah,
looking
madam,
back,
wait,
but I'm
wait.
sure there are a lot of hands.
Madam, yes madam. You want me to? Huh? Then we'll stop. After that we'll stop.
Yeah,
Okay?
this will be the last question.
Last question. No, I'll speak on that. After that we'll stop. I think by that time I'll have to leave now. Huh? See, see, this is that issue of cross-pathy practice. The issue is whether allopathic hospital can appoint Ayurvedic RMOs or homeopathic RMOs or Unani RMOs. Correct? This, because see, MBBS RMOs are a great problem to get. You know why? Because the moment they become MBBS and they become RMOs, they suffer from one problem. And that problem is pneumocranium. You know, lots of air in their heads. And you know, you can't even say anything to them. Because the next day they will say that I'm going to leave. And then you can't do anything about it. So their tantrums you have got to keep on tolerating. So it is much better that these alternative RMOs come. They are working very hard and sometimes much better than the MBBS RMOs. I'll tell you the law on this. Okay? What is the law? And this is that famous case is known as Poonam Verma versus Dr. Ashwin Patel. For those of you who are interested in the case law, you can Google search it, you will get the whole judgment. Poonam Verma versus Dr. Ashwin Patel. What happened in this case, I'll tell you. And how the law got settled on this issue is what I'm going to tell you all today. See, Poonam Verma's husband was having severe temperature. So this particular patient was taken to one Dr. Ashwin Patel, who was a homeopathic practitioner. Ashwin Patel got him investigated and based on the investigation prescribed ciprofloxacin with antipyretic. Okay? First 3 days the temperature came down, everything was fine. But third day the temperature started coming up again, and Dr. Ashwin Patel felt that the patient must now be treated in a tertiary care center. So this particular patient was referred to a tertiary care center. The patient subsequently died in the tertiary care center. This is the case. After the patient died, the widow was very much annoyed, and the first thing that the widow said was, "You are a homeopathic practitioner. Why is it that you treated my patient, my husband, with allopathic drugs about which you know nothing?" This was the case. The matter went to the National Commission. You know what the National Commission did? National Commission referred the entire file to AIIMS, All India Institute of Medical Sciences, and AIIMS gave an opinion on it. And the opinion was the doctor has done nothing wrong, the investigations were done, and whatever medicines he has prescribed were absolutely required for this particular problem. So there is no negligence on the part of the doctor. Based on the AIIMS opinion, National Commission dismissed the complaint. That was the case. The moment the case was dismissed, Poonam Verma got furious. So she said, I will file an appeal, and she went to the Supreme Court, which is the appellate authority after National Commission. And you know what the Supreme Court did? Supreme Court reversed the opinion of the National Commission, held Dr. Ashwin Patel guilty of something known as cross-pathy practice. So the Supreme Court said, if at all you are a graduate of one particular school of medicine, you must restrict your practice only to that school of medicine. You cannot jump schools. A homeopath cannot practice allopathic medicine. Ayurvedic cannot practice allopathic medicine. A Unani fellow cannot practice allopathic medicine. So that is what the law Supreme Court settled, and that is how this particular concept of cross-pathy practice came into existence. Now what happened was, the moment this kind of a ruling came, most of the governments of most of the states became very nervous, more so the government of Maharashtra, because the rural health service is basically manned by non-MBBS doctors. I don't know what the state in Karnataka is, but then it is like that. So what happened was, medicine is a state subject. So the government brought in a notification in Maharashtra, and that notification says that the Ayurvedic doctor can practice allopathic medicine. This notification is very much there in Maharashtra. Therefore, in Maharashtra, if at all the hospitals, allopathic hospitals appoint Ayurvedic RMOs, that would not be bad in law. This particular notification is there only with respect to Ayurvedics. A similar notification is in the offing with respect to homeopaths. The cabinet decision has already been made, but that still has not been gazetted. But Maharashtra is going in for polls very soon. If at all they gazette it prior to that, code of conduct period, everything is fine. Otherwise, the new government has got to take a call on it. Whether it's going to come or not come, we do not know. Now you tell me one thing, is this correct? Is this correct? So see, the Supreme Court in its judgment, when it gave the judgment, always there is a reasoning given to the judgment. The Supreme Court has said, when a person, a sick person, comes to a doctor, whether he is an allopathic doctor or a homeopathic doctor or an Ayurvedic doctor, the anatomy of the person is the same. The physiology of the person is also the same. The pathology that he is suffering from is also the same. But when it comes to pharmacodynamics, the pharmacodynamics of homeopathy is something which is totally different from the pharmacodynamics of allopathic medicine. Therefore, if at all you are not conversant with the pharmacodynamics of a particular school of medicine, going ahead and prescribing those drugs would not be the right thing to do. And if at all you do it, the Supreme Court has gone on record saying that such doctors are charlatans, they're cheats. And it amounts to something known as negligence per se. That means no further evidence need to be proved. Suppose on your allopathic letterhead, if I were to write I don't want to take that name, some drug which is a pure Ayurvedic drug, well, it would be very wrong in law. And if that prescription is kept in the court, no further evidence need to be adduced in the court, because cross-pathy practice is negligence per se. Why is it wrong? I'll tell you. See, there are lots of Ayurvedic doctors who are manning allopathic hospitals in Bombay. I think in Karnataka there is no such resolution passed by the government. I don't know what happens in Karnataka, but then I've been told that there is no such resolution passed. But then there has to be a resolution. Without that they can't do it. Huh? No, they must be appointed. The government must have appointed them to practice Ayurveda, na? No, but then without a resolution passed by the government, and without that resolution being gazetted, such a practice would be bad in law. Okay, once it is gazetted, like what has happened in Maharashtra, it's perfectly all right. Yeah. Why there is a problem? Listen to me. Normally, there are two ways in which these people manage patients. First thing is, the consultant comes on the rounds, prescribes certain drugs. What the homeopath does is just dispenses those drugs. That's perfectly all right. If a nurse can dispense, why not a registered medical practitioner? A homeopath is also a registered medical practitioner. Okay? School of Indian Medicine. Okay? But the problem is not there. The problem is in an emergency. Suppose there's a patient who comes with status epilepticus or status asthmaticus, and suppose you've got to give that patient aminophylline intravenously. Now here is the problem. So in an emergency, whether homeopaths are capable of prescribing allopathic drugs, and that too in a patient who is hemodynamically unstable? The answer is no. And that is why having such doctors might be a little risky, but if at all they work under the supervision of some other person, that would be perfectly all right. Have I answered your question? Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I know you all don't want to leave me. Even I don't want to leave you all. But then say, there's a very famous saying. Mark me out. Who makes a good lover? We all are adults over here, so I can, resort to some dirty jokes. Who makes a good lover? Do you know this? A good lover knows when to stop, and he stops when his partner wants more. This is the surest way. This is the surest way of seeing that you are called again. Thank you very much.